It is now recording. All right, so we are live. All right, everyone. So just to get started, today we're going to talk about the Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Power Automate. So I'm not going to talk about them as two separate things. I am in the presentation, but then I'm going to show you guys how I use the graph in Power Automate. And I'm also going to show you a few other little tricks that I've learned along the way about how to use some other tools to help me do Power Automate and to use the graph as part of that. So you'll see some kind of fun stuff that I've done in the past. I'll show you some Power Automates and everything else, but I'll also show you some of the graph stuff. And then I'm also going to show you kind of a quick thing too. If you've ever used some of the adaptive cards or ever thought about using adaptive cards within Teams, I'm going to show you guys a flow that I kind of created, kind of used from someone else who had started to create one that way to use an adaptive card within Power Automate too, just to kind of give you guys a little different view too. So let me go ahead and get started. A little bit about me. I'm Bill Feldker. I'm a cloud architect for Valorem Reply. I've been a SharePoint developer since 2003, so that really dates me. I used that old code that was nasty and hard to use. So it's much better now. I gave a little presentation on SPFX this morning. And so that's better stuff to use, but Power Automate just will really lighten up your day if you're not used to using it. So kind of what we'll talk about today, we'll kind of run through what is Power Automate, the ecosystem of Power Automate, Microsoft Graph, the Graph Explorer, which will allow you to really help, troubleshoot your graph calls, and then some demos at the very end. So I'm saving all my demos to the end. We will be done early. I don't expect this to go the full hour at all. I try to keep mine to like 35 to 40 minutes. And then with questions, we're done plenty of time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So what is Power Automate? Power Automate is a service that helps you create automated workflows. Obviously, it's what everybody wants to use now. It helps you do things like synchronize files, send notifications out, and also, collect data and so much more. I'll show you some really fun stuff as we go through here. It helps you work smarter by automating workflows across your apps, and I even mentioned, getting notifications, collecting data, automating approvals, which is a fun one, especially if you're replacing your old SharePoint, 2010, 2013 workflows, 2010 especially, since they're now no longer supported by Microsoft and don't work in the cloud. But, if you're trying to replace those with some approvals, you can do that as well. And so let's jump into the ecosystem. You've got templates already. So the easiest way to get started with Power Automate is just to create some go in there, kick up a couple templates and start from there. There's hundreds of them. You can start with a trigger action or a connector of any type. Just start typing in SharePoint and you'll see all the different connectors for SharePoint. So it really gives you kind of a powerful way to do it. This picture over on the right is really old. So logos have changed, things like that. So it's kind of fun. There are service connections. So one of the things as I mentioned connectors. There are hundreds and hundreds of connectors. So you can see some of them here, over off to the right, but a connector is basically a wrapper around an API that Microsoft Power Automate has some predefined logic and tasks that it can do, some triggers, some actions, things like that as part of the connectors. So any connector that you have will either have an action associated with it or a trigger or both as you go through it. So what we can talk about with triggers and actions is a trigger is a starting point for Power Automate. It's the way that the flow kicks off. It's what causes it to kick off. A lot of the different connectors, for instance, I'll just use SharePoint as my base one. I add a new item to a SharePoint list. That can trigger a Power Automate to run. But you can also do things like scheduling, where I schedule a task to run, or a Power Automate to kick off once a day, once a week, once a month. And then it can do the scheduling like you always want to do, with other stuff, which by the way is a SharePoint 2010 workflow, not as super useful as that feature. You can also manually trigger, so you can create like buttons and things like that to trigger a flow too, where within your phone you can click a button and it'll kick off the trigger. Haven't seen that used as much, but if you want to think about some of the other things, is you can do that connected to an app, and so a Power App can actually call a Power Automate flow. An action is anything that Power Automate flow is doing. It can include sending notifications, using services like SQL Server, Teams, or SharePoint. I'll show you guys Microsoft Teams and how I'm using Teams heavily inside of our Power Automate to trigger things in Teams. So that's something that's going to be really, really important as we go through this, and super helpful. And again, guys, if you guys have any questions, come off mute, ping me, jump right in, ask questions. No problem slowing me down, because I have no problem answering any questions you guys might have. And especially at the end, if you guys want to really dig into something else, we can always do that as well. So sharing, it used to be that you couldn't share your flows. Now, this was several years ago, so it kind of dates me also. But now you can share your flows within your organization and your teams, but you can also share it with the general public. Now, when I say that, you can also do it by an export, but you can also share it to the general public by getting it approved by Microsoft as an official, flow and I call it still flows. So I will keep both names because I think it's a Power Automate flow is the individual item. So I'm going to jump over to the graph and make sure everybody kind of understands what the graph is. So the Microsoft graph is a gateway to data, intelligence, anything Microsoft 365. It basically provides a unified programming model that you can then access those features in it. It goes across a lot of different things as you're doing. I kind of show a little, where graphic here where the graph fits in. So the graph kind of sits over here on top of all of these things that it can actually do.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
You know how PowerPoint does that thing where one's the notes view and one's the presentation view? You're sharing the notes
You're right.
view.
Let me change that. Sorry, that's great. It was not supposed to be doing that.
Thanks, Matt, for pointing that out.
Yeah, super helpful. How's that?
I didn't notice it at first. It just occurred to me.
This will help you guys be able to read it much better too, because it'll be bigger. So, all right. Well, sorry about that, guys, but let's continue moving forward. So what's in the Microsoft graph? And so what it does is the graph actually exposes the REST APIs for Microsoft. So all the little client libraries, data access points for their cloud services. So if you want to think about what that includes, it includes Microsoft M365. So Excel, Delve, Office 365 users, SharePoint, Planner, Teams, but it also does the enterprise mobility and security services. So if you want to think about what it can also do, it can hit Azure Active Directory, Identity Manager, and Intune. So earlier, Patrick Whitbroad gave a presentation on the identity platform within Microsoft, and you can use the graph to attach into that. Windows 10 services like activities, devices, notifications, things like that. And then obviously Dynamics 365 Business Central. So kind of keeps a idea of it can actually go into all of those different features. And you'll see some of that when I bring up the Graph Explorer. But kind of gives you like a little graph image, where it can fit into this. So this is all part of the graph. This was Microsoft when they first were doing the presentation about the graph. They kept showing like a brain map like this one, a mind map, where they actually showed all the different things and how it all interconnects to a user. And then the graph can pull that information in. So that's kind of the idea of what the graph is. It has access to everything in M365, and yet you can get access to it very easily with a little bit of a few different API calls and some security that you might have to set up. So let's talk about the Graph Explorer, because I don't know how many, let's see a raise of hands. Let me pop up on my screen so I can see it again. See a raise of hands. Who's used the Graph Explorer? Oh, good. There's a couple people. No, not everyone, but that's all right. There's a few. That's okay. So the Graph Explorer is, let me jump right over to the slide. It's actually a web-based tool that you can use to build and test Graph API requests. So you can actually go into there. There's other tools like Postman and things like that, but the Graph Explorer is just a web-based, browser-based, tool that you can actually go in and make calls to it. And I even put the URL at the bottom, how you get to the Graph Explorer. And I'll actually be pulling it up in a little bit because we'll be showing you guys how to make some calls in it. But this is kind of what it looks like. There's me in my dev environment. And then here's like a graph, what a graph call might look like, an API. Ooh, let me go back one. I clicked on that one. But you can see, it's like using a get or a post, and then you can actually make your calls here. So I'll be showing that as we go through it. I'm going to jump into my first demo, and this is going to be a demo that hopefully you guys will see the need for, is automatically doing a Teams creation. And so this happens quite a bit with with users, and especially with clients of ours who say, "Ooh, we need to do a we need to be able to provision Teams for people, maybe request through a form or something like that." And I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do that as I go through this. So let me pop up. I think I'm sharing my whole screen. So a couple different things that I'll pull up as I get started here is to show you that there is a really, really nice set of documentation for the Microsoft Graph. I'll include this. I'll put this in a post on my right underneath my session so you guys can see this. The Graph Explorer is right there, but I'll be getting back to that one as we go through this. And then I'm going to show you guys a flow, and I'm going to show you a couple different ones. I'm going to show you this one first, because this one is actually creating a team and tabs from Power Automate. And so, our Power Apps. So I'm going to have a Power App, and I'm going to go ahead and kick this thing off as we go through it, and then I'll walk through what it's doing. Go ahead and name my team Feldker 123. Super creative, but that's okay. And then I'm just going to click request. You could add a lot more things like, hey, I want to do, different tabs and things like that within your Power App. But here I have it. And if I refresh the screen, we should see it running. And it failed. Awesome. Let me see if it failed in the same spot it has been failing. It did. Resubmit it and it will work. This is I don't have a pause in here, and I think I need to have a pause in to get it to fly. So when I resubmit it, it should go through. It didn't. It already created the group, didn't it? All right, well, we'll run this again in just a second. But to give you guys, let me go through this, because I'm going to go through this whole thing. I have a pause that I need to do in this one to fix it. But basically what I did is I actually have the trigger being a Power App. The team name is being pulled in, which I'm creating, from the Power App. The tenant ID, that's just my tenant ID. I'm not going to pop that one open. I also have the client ID and the secret ID, and you say, wait a second, why do you need that? And I'll get to that as I go through. I have an ID number, which actually is a specific reason to get an ID from. And then you'll see here now that I have a call that says generate access token for planner and a generate access token. So what I have to do in order to call the Graph API from a Power Automate flow is I have to actually go into the graph and get approval to actually make those calls. And so there's a little setup you have to do ahead of time to get that. So if I come into Azure Active Directory, and so I just went out to, if you go to your admin inside of your Office 365, you can get to your admin portal for Azure Active Directory. And then if I click over to Azure Active Directory, I can go to, on the left-hand side, there's app registrations. And if I click that, you'll see I have several app registrations. I'm going to do the create team one, just so you can see this. And then I'm actually going to go into the API permissions. So in here, and I have a whole lot selected just to kind of show people what there's all available out here. But if I would add a permission, I can see there's the Microsoft Graph across the top, and then there's some other individual ones. But if I do the Microsoft Graph and I say application permissions versus delegated, now I can actually get in and I can actually choose all the different roles that I may want it to have. And you'll see that I've got groups in here. I've got notes for OneNote. I've got sites to create sites. I've got team members, team settings, team, and I added a couple of these just to make sure everything would work. I've got users. So all of this stuff is available to me. And you can see that I have already, if I request a new one, like let's do, yeah, whatever, doesn't matter which one. And I add that permission, you'll see that it's up here and it's waiting to be approved. So I have to grant admin consent for that one. And once I do that, then it's granted. And so it should be all green at this point. So that's kind of the key, is that if you see a red one, that means it's not granted yet. And that's something you have to do to make some of these API calls. So once I get that, I can pass in.
Hey, Bill, can I ask one question?
You absolutely may.
You kind of went through there about application versus delegated permissions. Could you just kind of spend just a brief moment kind of highlighting the difference between the two and the impact it have on the end user or the
Right.
user of the app?
Yep. So it all depends on what your app is doing. But when you're doing, whether you want the application to make the call and to run as the application, or whether you want the call to be delegated as the user that's coming through the app. So that's the big difference between the two. With this situation, I'm doing a lot of application and very little delegated permissions because I want the application to run on its own. And so that's the reason why I chose application, but you can have it so it's delegated as the user that's being passed through. All right, let's jump back in. So you can see I'm going to make a call to my tenant. I'm going to pass in a client ID and a secret. And then now I can parse my access token. And then I can go into a group and create the group. So this is the way that the old way, and I'll call this the old way of creating a team. You had to create a group. And then once you created the group, you had to parse through and get the group ID. And then you can create a team, using a different call to create that team. So it's doing a put method and then, a post method, a put method to create the team. Once I create the team, then I can create channels. And then in those channels, I can create a tab for library, planner, a power app if I want to add a power app thing. So all of these functionalities are capable, and you'll see these are all API calls from the graph. So if I do, you can see the post calls from the graph to do all of these different things. Now, the really cool thing is Microsoft said, yeah, that's really awesome. But what we'd love to do is be able to say, hey, can I just create a team? I don't want to have to create a group and do all of these 5 different steps. Can I just create a team? So then what I did is I said, you know what? Let's figure this guy out. So you'll see there's a lot of failed attempts at this one. So I have this one as a manually triggered flow, but you'll see here, I have the call to actually get again, I still have to get my token, my authentication token to say, hey, my app has the rights to create this. And, it's a security feature. And then it's going to set a variable, which is just my access token. And then I make a single call to the graph. Now notice the one hint here is this is a beta call. So it's a beta call because it hasn't been approved and released by Microsoft. These are a little bit dangerous to use in your production environments because they could change. But I've been using this one for a little bit and it's pretty sweet because now in here, the payload is I can create a team from a standard template. You can see down here, I'll kind of highlight this and let me actually make this a little bit bigger. I don't want people to have to squint, to see everything I'm doing here. So it's a little bit bigger here now. So you can see that we have, where I'm doing a standard template, but you can also use your own custom templates, which is pretty nice to be able to do that. I get to set the display name, the description, but this isn't all. I can do of other things in this single call with this beta call to Microsoft Teams. But if you want to see what I can do to do that, what I do is I come up here and I say, you know what, let me go in here. Let me grab this guy, go to the Graph Explorer and populate this guy in here. And you'll notice when I populated that beta Teams in, that it turned over from a version 1.0 to beta, and it also populated the get for me. And so as I look through here, and if I would just try to run this query, you'll see, get Teams is not supported. But if I do a post method, and I actually put in my request body, which I'm going to go back to my flow because boy, oh boy, I'd hate to have to try to recreate that. Just jumped right out of that one. That's a fun one to deal with. HTTP. So here I can actually go into here, copy the body of this guy. And actually the way I would have done it is I would have actually done the request body up here. And this would have been my initial how to build this thing out would be to test this and put the body up in here, which any of these calls that you're looking for to create, Microsoft has documentation on any one of these. So if I would actually go into Microsoft documentation, I could find how to do a Teams call and do the post method on it. And if I run this query, I should get a response here in a second that accepted it. So if I go back out to Teams now, and there's my sample team that I just created using not from the Power Automate, but actually from the Microsoft Graph Explorer. So I ran this query and it created a team. So if I click on this team, click in the general tab, there's nothing in there right now, but I'm going to go ahead and delete that team. I understand, I'm deleting everything. There, it's gone. Now if I come over to my flow and I just do a test run, I'll perform the trigger action and click test, run the flow, click done. Now when I do this, it's going to kick over into the variables and everything else, and it's going to be waiting at the call to do the HTTP request. But in here, I can actually see what was requested. You can see that it'll automatically remove the authentication and authorization tokens for me. So if someone would come back into my flow, and they wouldn't be able to see that information. So it's just a way to kind of control it. Here's the result was a 202. Here's the output. And then if I come into Teams, it created that team for me. So it was actually able to create a team based off of the out of the box team very quickly. And you can also then create tabs and everything else in it that you want to do. So any questions about the Graph Explorer, creating teams, or using Power Automate in this respect? I'll give people a minute if they do have questions. And if not, I will jump to my demo too, which is, let me.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
Sorry if you already answered this. Were any of those flow actions premium?
Yes. I will answer that. That's a great point. Let me pop this back up real quick. So you guys will see this, and it wasn't blatantly obvious, but in here, what if I will add, let me add a new step here so you can see it, and I go HTTP. If I go to HTTP and I click on it, you'll see that it's premium. So doing the HTTP calls is a premium. And so one of the things that we tend to do, service account that's running, which is also why we have it, set up with an application, ID, so that the service account is running that. And so I can assign a premium license to that service account and run. There are limitations on the total number of runs a single account can have in Flow. So there are things that you have to look out for. But if you can plan for that, you can also plan for, hey, I have different service accounts running different things. And in fact, for one of my clients I worked with, for every flow that they have that's using an API graph call or anything like that, they actually have a separate service account running that flow so that they can manage those service accounts, turn them on or off as they go through it, so they can secure those features down as well. But great question, Matt. Thanks. All right, so just kind of recap what we did. We created groups, created teams, channels, and then we used the Microsoft Graph. So now I'm going to jump over to the next demo, which is actually creating the adaptive cards. And so I'll kind of walk through this one and show you guys what I'm doing. I'm also going to show you the demo. It's a little fun demo, which makes it a little more interesting. It'd be better if we were like at 4:30, but we'll go ahead and kick through it anyway. So when I go into this flow, but I'm actually going to go up, zoom back out a little bit. And I'm actually going to go into Teams and show you this team in here. So in here, you'll see that I'm doing a couple different things. And some of these flows take a little bit longer to run because Teams is the trigger. So I'm actually going to be calling, I'm going to actually make the same exact call so you can see what it actually does. And then I'm actually going to, a new conversation, pop it in. So I'm doing a pound drink help, and I'm going to run this. And like I said, sometimes these flows take a little bit to run. And so we'll see how long it actually takes to run and to do stuff. But then I'll kind of jump into the flow to actually run stuff. So the other one is I can do a drink name and then the name of the drink. So I'm also going to kick off one of those as we go through this. Thought the zombie one was pretty cool for a zombie apocalypse. There we go. So I'm going to kick those two off, and it's going to take a little bit to run those because of the way it runs. But let's go into the flow and see what we're doing. And then I'm going to show you that Microsoft has a really cool tool that we can use as we're going through this. So when a new channel message is added, and this is a preview feature, so you can see that, when it's added, but there's also something else that I don't know how many of you have actually used, but in the settings, you can actually set trigger conditions so that this only triggers if it meets these conditions. And this condition is that it contains the trigger body content has a pound drink in it. If it doesn't have pound drink in it, this flow is going to ignore that and not run. So you can actually set up trigger conditions based off the content that's coming in. You do have to do a little bit of a finagling to make sure this works correctly. So you have to play with it to make sure that when you do these calls that it is working. Cancel my settings. So I'm hitting my team drinks in the general channel, and then it's going to initiate a user, and it's going to do the message from the user. It's going to compose a split. And so, this is just getting my different ingredients and things like that. But here's the big working piece of this. So it's got a switch statement in here because remember I had drinks. I had drink name. I had drink help in here, which is just going to post a message there. And then I have case 4, which is, drink ingredients. And then the default doesn't do anything. It just basically you didn't pass in the right stuff. So one of the things I did pass was a drink help. And this is going to post a formatted message to Teams that has, this nice layout of how it looks. The other one that I did was this drink and name one. And so what I'm doing here is I'm actually making an API call. So you saw that I did that API call earlier. This is not a Microsoft API call. This is actually out to the cocktail database. And then I'm actually going to parse content that's coming out of it, ingredients and things like that. And then I'm going to apply a drink recipe. And so you'll see this one, post your own adaptive card as the Flowbot to a channel. And again, it's a preview thing, but it's pretty cool. So what I can do is actually post a message that is an adaptive card out to there. And so you can see all the different features that are coming in to that adaptive card. Now let's go out to Teams and see if it's actually worked. Okay, it did. Perfect. So here's my drink name response. And so you can see that adaptive card kind of lays out in a really nice way where it's got like the name of the drink, a picture of the drink, and then the instructions on how to do it, and then also the ingredients. And so if I go back to my flow, I can see that, that is exactly what I asked it to do, where it's actually going to be pulling in a text block, the fact sheet, the ID, and then as I go down here, some ingredients as I pull down through here. And then here's the thumbnail in the second column. And then the action URL. So again, one of the things I did have was more info. And if I click this guy, it should open a YouTube on how to make the zombie drink. So just kind of some fun stuff you can do with that. So you can say, well, that's awesome, but how do I create these adaptive cards? Because it's not just, I just didn't go in there and just throw stuff together, because if I'd have tried to do that, I would have never gotten it to work. So what I do is you actually can go out here to Microsoft's Adaptive Cards IO Designer. And so what you can do is I can say, I need a new card. It says, well, what do you want your card to look like? Pick a starting point. And so you can see all these different cards that Microsoft's already pre-built. And so I can, build something that looks like this. And so when I started with something like that. I can click this guy. Let me open up that guy and open up this guy. So you can see that here's the type that's an adaptive card. Here's the body as I'm building it out. And then you can also see here's the data that's being pushed into it as I go through. And so as I scroll down here, you can see there's a column as I'm pulling through this. And so it helps you build out the card as you want to. So when I built out this adaptive card that looks like this, and I did it in my flow, I actually took this guy, and of course now it has some data in it and things like that, but I was able to capture this stuff out. And I did the designer first and was able to pull all my pieces in to build it out. So just to kind of give you an idea, this is a great tool to use to build your adaptive cards as you're doing that. So just kind of a fun little thing that you can do with Flow into Teams. So if you want to think about another usage of this, you might actually have a ServiceNow instance, and you can have a ticket was submitted into ServiceNow, and it can actually post to the IT team, and it can actually put an adaptive card in the IT team where they can actually click on the Get Details button, and it takes them back out to ServiceNow to the specific ticket so they can get started working on it if they're living in teams. So it gives you some other functionality that you can use it for as you're going through it. Any questions about the adaptive cards or the flow that was put together to use those? Quiet group. I've got quite a few people in here, but again, if you also have other questions and you don't want to just say them out loud, you can always throw them in the conversation tab. So let me jump back to the presentation. Not much left here to talk about, but here's kind of what we did. You know, building a flow to trigger off a team's conversation, and I even showed you guys how to do a conditional action in there, referencing an API through the flow. You know, again, calling that API that we called for the drinks lab, building adaptive card in flow. So it's building that adaptive card and then the demoing of the adaptive card designer, and then sending a response back to teams. And so that response that went back had the adaptive card in it and showed you guys how to do that. So that just kind of gives you a preview of everything that I showed you in that last demo. And so if you are watching the video later, or if you get a chance to want to look at the video later, and you can follow through with the presentation about all the things that happened in that last little demo. So I was going to end early, and I did. So if you guys have any other questions, and you want to, you know, just different things you want to talk about, feel free to jump in and ask questions. I got a hand clap. Very good. I love that. Thanks, Alan. And again, I'll post those 3 links that I talked about. So I'll post the graph documentation, the graph explorer, and the adaptive card IO building out there so that you guys can see it, as well as you guys should be able to get to the presentations and the videos.
That's very cool, Bill.
All right.
Hey, Bill?
Any other? Yes.
Yeah, I got a question. You kind of touched on it earlier with the whole, when we got into that premium connector discussion about how do you usually set up, or what account, like, is in terms of what accounts are running flows and managing that. I was just kind of curious about, do you use the whole like service principal method of running things, or?
So we kind of
I mean?
have to take a look at that and talk about how it's being used, right? So when we're creating a flow, and let's say we're creating a flow that's going to be an enterprise flow, so it's going to be used across my enterprise. I don't want that flow being run as Joe, because Joe may quit the company, and then the flow, whatever the connectors, if I don't have access to the right SharePoint site as Joe, then that flow stops working. So what we want to do is we want to create like a service account for that. And again, remember I said it's an enterprise level app, right? I'm talking about something that your enterprise is going to use. And this is going to be the app that we're using. So that's one of the things that we usually recommend, is that there is a service account. Some clients have gone as far as creating service accounts for every flow, or I won't say every application that they're doing, so that they are very isolated out, and that service account only does that one thing. I've seen others that create like an Office 365 service account that runs everything. But like I said, the danger of that is you can only do a single account, can only create, and Jay, if you're there to help keep me honest, can only create 500 groups at one time. And so once you create that 501, it stops working. So if you do have like a Teams provisioning one, or a group provisioning one, you will hit that threshold sooner or later, even though you said there's no way we'll create 500 teams. You'll create thousands very quickly. And so that's something that you may have to, you know, acknowledge and say, okay, yeah, we'll have to make sure that we don't hit that 500, or we change the owner of that group after we create it, so that it's not that service account that's going to get stuck. If the service account is a global admin role, then it can do whatever it wants to do. So that's the other thing, is if I'm a global admin, I can create as many groups as I want to. I'm not limited by the 500. Sorry, Matt, that was kind of a long-winded answer for that one, but yes, we tend to recommend creating service accounts to run our flows that are going to be enterprise level. You're muted. Matt, you're muted.
Thank you. A follow-up question to get just in the weeds for just a second. So does someone, a developer, sign in as that service account, or do you, because as yourself, I know you can create connections, like have 2 SharePoint connectors set up one's under your name and one's under an that service account?
So what we do is, and this was especially when I'm working with clients. So I'm a consultant, so I spend a lot of time working with different clients. When we're working with clients, I'll usually document the flow, export it out, and then we'll import it in with the new connectors being set up with that service account. So usually I don't have access to the service account. So that's usually one of the tricks is I don't have access to that service account. So I'll say, here's my flow. I export it out. I'll document it as here's the description of what the flow does. Here's the triggers on it. Here's the actions that it's going to, in the connectors it's going to use. And then we'll help set them up on their side, and then they'll do that part of it, but they'll log in as the service account and do that, with the connection.
Yeah, we had something similar happen with a service account or with one of our flows, and we wanted it to be on a service account. We had some developers creating something. It was generating calendar items through a flow similar to what Bill showed. The problem was that service account was being used not just within Flow, it was being used in our Power BI area, and in some cases to connect to a SQL server. So you have to be careful you don't, if you're going to let people log in as that service account, that it's one that is scoped to their access needs.
Right.
You have to be careful you don't overgrant privileges to that person with that service account, or it doesn't get shared from person to person. Otherwise, you'll get stuck in a very non-scalable scenario, like you described, having to export it and import it and then retest everything in production, or potentially even having to screen share and convert it over. I do think though, Matt, if you had someone with that service account create the connector to whatever you need, like a card that was shown here or something else, other users can select that connector that user ID used.
Yep.
And that's probably a safer way to go and a more scalable way to go. Both outcomes, both will get you the outcome you want, and they're both going to require a little bit of extra testing, both in dev and particularly when you try and promote it up to production.
I have a client that we do that with, Glenn, where they create the flow for me with just the connectors. That's it. They don't do anything else. They say, I'm going to create these 3 connectors in it, and that's what I ask them to do. And then I build out the rest of it for them. And then they're like, oh, it works perfect. And so I'm really testing it in real time as we go through it. So now it works in production, and I don't have to worry about the back and forth, the exporting out. Like, it's different clients have different needs as you're working through them. And so the export is one of my clients. The other one, they create the flow with the connectors, and then I just go and change everything and make sure it works the way we want it to work.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I think, Glenn, you have one coming up at 2:00, right? Where you talk about Power Automate?
I do talk a little more about Power Automate and go through our case study, and it's pretty fun stuff. So promotion there, yes.
So
but we
if
have
any
time until then. So I think there might be a session in between.
There is. It's like some kind of ask the experts, I think, or something to that effect. So we'll all probably be in on that one too. But if anybody wants to join in on Glenn's, feel free to hop in and see what else you can do with Power Automate.
Yeah. And there is another session going on right now on securing your apps that probably has another 20 minutes. So,
all right. Well, if there's nothing else, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll let you guys have some time back or join another group, get another cup of coffee if you need it. And we'll see you guys in a different session.
Thanks, Bill.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.